You guys asked for it and I'm here to deliver. This is my first ever history video that I'm posting on my YouTube channel. I know that you guys are used to seeing me do more lifestyle and vlogs, but I am a historian and a history lover at heart. And I already did a mini series of this on my TikTok and I got so many requests to turn it into a YouTube video. So here we are. This is the historical breakdown of the film Sinners. I absolutely love this movie. Apart from the performances, the attention to detail that was given by the director Ryan Coogler was just amazing when it came to the world building. The historical context in this film is inextricably linked to the plot, and I feel like even he said in interviews he had to become a historian, a musician, all these different things in order to bring this movie to life. And I am going to be doing an in-depth historical breakdown of the time in which it's based, which is 1930s Louisiana, the main arcs and storylines in the plot, and all the symbolism and other things that we have been debating on social media for so long. So I hope you guys love this video as much as I'm going to enjoy making it. And if you want any other history videos or things that you want me to talk about which are educational, please leave a comment down below. And if I miss anything as well, leave a comment down below because I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, let's get into it. All the products I'm going to be using are going to be listed down below as well, just in case you see anything and I don't mention it. Just look in the description. Pardon me. Like I said, you guys highly requested this video. Like, I had comments dogging me out, asking me for part 3, part 4, part 5. So like I said, I had to deliver. I had to give you guys what you want. But let's get into it. So the film is set in 1930s. If you're not familiar with this period in history, this is a period of time where Black Americans lived under the thumb of white supremacy. White supremacy was in every aspect of their lives, whether it was jobs, it was education, it was just the treatment. They lived under complete segregation under laws known as Jim Crow. And it's funny actually because when Stack is turned into a vampire, he makes a reference to saying like, oh, who do you think it is, Jim Crow? And a lot of people didn't know who that was, so we're going to get into that. So when we are introduced to a lot of the main characters, we actually see them picking cotton. And even my mum and I spoke about this because a lot of people aren't aware that although slavery officially ended in 65, black people were still picking cotton all the way into the 1900s, some as late as actually the 1940s and 50s because of something known as sharecropping. Specifically Preacher Boy Sammy and Cornbread that are seen picking cotton when we're introduced to them as characters, and they're working long hours in the field in the hot sun in Mississippi. Sharecropping was a system that essentially kept black people tied to the land as indentured servants, but we're going to go into more detail as to how this system took place. Actually, sharecropping is a legal agreement in which the tenant or the landowner, who was majority of the time white, and the tenants, who were always poor black people, entered into an agreement where they could work the land for the season. However, at the end of the season, the landowner would get a share of the crop, so sharecropping. The main crop at the time that was funding the industry in the South was obviously cotton production, so it made sense that former enslaved people and their descendants would just continue on in the work that they had been doing for free for hundreds of years. But like I said, this essentially tied the sharecroppers to the land. They were never going to earn enough money to be able to leave and start a new life for themselves. So another way in which black people were kept working under this white supremacist system was something called convict leasing. And we also see this when we see the prisoners on the side of the road who are digging and they're wearing the uniforms with the stripes on it. Convict leasing was a form of forced labour that was used in the South, which is when prisoners were taken out of prison and forced to work for businesses or corporations or for the state. However, you need to understand the racial element to this. At this time, black people were over-policed, they were stereotyped, and they were arrested for petty crimes such as begging and loitering. So as a black man or even a black woman, you would go to jail for nothing and then essentially have your labour rented out and go back into that system of slavery. It was kind of a loophole to the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, that was like a bit of a tongue twister, was ratified in 1865, and this basically states that slavery is illegal and it is not lawful for anybody to be a slave except if they are a criminal. So what does then this white supremacist system do? They criminalize black people to put them into the system so that they become slaves again. It's just a whole cycle of control and a way to again exploit black labor, and it worked. There were thousands of black men in the South that were essentially working for free under the system of convict leasing, being in prison sometimes for crimes they didn't commit, or like I said, for petty crimes such as just being homeless. And how rich do you think those landowners and business owners got from using free labor. I'm going to dive a bit more into what Jim Crow is, because again that dominates the storyline of Sinners as they're living in Jim Crow, Mississippi. And Jim Crow is just the name for the laws of segregation that were placed upon Black Americans at this time in history. However, its origin is really interesting. Jim Crow, the character, actually comes from a caricature created by a white man. This Jim Crow character or persona was created by Thomas Dartmouth Rice in the early 1800s, and this character was used in minstrel shows. If you don't know what minstrel shows is, just think about going to the theatre or Broadway and it's a racist play. It was essentially a way of mocking Black people through stereotypes such as us being lazy, thieves, being a threat to white women and to white society. Basically any negative stereotype you can think of for Black people, this is what was portrayed at minstrel shows for the entertainment of white Americans. This is where the whole stereotypes of us liking fried chicken and the whole watermelon smile comes from. It's very nasty and distasteful stuff that they thought was entertaining, basically. This Jim Crow character that this actor Thomas created became really popular. I'm going to insert a picture of this Jim Crow on the screen just so you can see what kind of characteristics they thought Black Americans held, and the way that it was kind of a mockery of everything that we stood for. Just to give you guys an example of how long Jim Crow and segregation actually lasted, the laws were originally instated in the late 1800s, and the last Jim Crow law was overturned in 1965. My mum, who's obviously still alive today, was born in 1966, only 1 year after Jim Crow was overturned. So when people like to act like racism is like years away and it has no impact and it was so long ago, it really wasn't. There are people alive today that still have living memory of Jim Crow and the way that segregation affected their lives. There's people living today that marched in the civil rights marches against Jim Crow. So I find it really reductive when people say to never forget things like the Holocaust, but then Black people are constantly told, oh, just forget it, it was so long ago. It really wasn't, and that's just the truth of the matter. All tragedies should be held to equal standard. So next I want to talk about the main characters, who are played by Michael B. Jordan. So the protagonists are the two twins, which is Stack and Smoke. Stack seems to be the kind of more confident, more out there, more passionate twin, and Smoke is the one that's more subdued, more reserved, kind of like the elder brother archetype who just wants to protect Stack. And I think the dichotomy in their characters is very intentional and also very symbolic in their costuming, which is really a nod to how intelligent Ryan Coogler is. Because in the opening scenes of when we get introduced to them, and they have the famous line that's like, nah, we cousins, Stack is wearing a red like fedora and Smoke is wearing a blue flat cap. So those of you who don't pay attention to things like this think that just maybe a coincidence, but it's actually very intentional. As you guys know, before Stack and Smoke come back to Mississippi to open the juke joint, they had first off fought in World War I, and then they had gone to Chicago to make their fortune. And the way that they made their fortune was through allying themselves, Stack with the Italian mob and then Smoke with the Irish gangsters. The Irish gangsters and their style is associated with the flat cap, which is very reminiscent of the British Isles, and then the red fedora is symbolic of the Italians. Even in their costuming, we're getting a lot of a nod to their backstory alone, and I thought that was really smart the way he did that. I'll go even more into depth with this because the fact that Stack is the passionate brother and the one that kind of acts on an impulse is a lot of foreshadowing to what's going to happen to him later on in the film. And also Smoke and his colour of blue, which symbolises kind of calm and logic, is again foreshadowing for what's going to happen later on in the film, when one is going to be turned into a vampire and the other one decides to stay and fight and take the logical route. Guys, nose contour is so important to me, so I literally spend a long time doing it because I want to have a little pinched nose. Oh. And also, everybody that says has a nose job, you're lying. Never had one. To quickly touch on Smoke and Stack's history, fighting in World War I. They gave us a little bit of a nod to that past in the story, and it's really important to say that a lot of people don't understand how many Black soldiers contributed to the winning of World War I, and I feel like that's quite overlooked when we talk about Remembrance Day and speak about how we beat out Germany and all these different kind of things. 380,000 Black American soldiers left their soil to fight in World War I. Bear in mind, they're fighting for a country that doesn't see them as equal, doesn't see them as human, and they're putting their life on the line to die for a country that has treated them like dirt, essentially. And I think that's also really important to the story of Sinners, because despite the fact that Smoke and Stack had both fought for their country and done the right thing and been patriots, they were still seen as just another black person. When they came back home to America, they were still treated with the same indignity that other black Americans were, which further goes to show that no matter what they did, they would never be free per se, and that freedom that they were chasing in the juke joint is linked to this. As you guys know, we have to talk about my girl Annie. She is one of my favorite characters in the whole film, and she's actually the spiritual backbone of the show and the reason why there are any survivors of that night at the juke joint. So if you guys weren't aware, Annie is Smoke's love interest, and it is hinted that when he comes back they had a baby that passed away, because you see him laying flowers at the grave outside of Annie's shop. And Annie is also a practitioner of Hudoo. Now, for those of you that don't know, obviously we're all black, we're told like you don't dabble in judge and witchcraft and all this stuff, but Hudoo is an officially recognized religion that many people practice, especially in the South in America, because of the deep historical ties that they have to it. So in order to differentiate from judge and whatever stuff that you may be scared of, I'm going to give an explanation of what Hudoo is, and I'm going to try and respect it, because all religions should be respected. I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding around like what it is. So Hudoo is like a very spiritual religion that kind of grew up out of the practices of enslaved Africans in the South. So when almost 12 million African slaves were taken from Africa to the Americas, so not just America but South America as well, they brought a lot of their religious practices with them. So whether this was their spiritual beliefs, the deities that they believed in, the orishas, whatever it is that they practiced in Africa, they obviously held onto when they were brought to the US. However, when they were brought to the US, they were forcibly converted to Christianity because the slave owners needed a way to control them, not only physically but mentally. And this is not anything against Christianity, this is just a fact. Christianity was used as a tool of enslavement, and we all know that. A lot of the time they had parts of the Bible that spoke about freedom and equality actually taken out, and gave the slaves very limited editions of the Bible that only spoke about being meek and how being a slave is punishment and God's will in order to keep their minds subdued. So you can actually Google this, that there were such things known as slave Bibles that were a way of controlling the American slaves in this period. Hudoo though is the mixture of the practices that they brought from Africa and of the Christianity that they were taught, and it came together and formed this new religion that a lot of people practice in the South. When you research Hudoo, you'll see that it has a lot of Christian elements, but its basis is in African spirituality, and this again is what Annie practices in Sinners. The main tenets of the religion are about healing and protection and being in touch with nature and the world around you and your ancestors as well. And I feel like sometimes that can lead people to be fearful of it, but when I've done my research, it actually seems to be quite an interesting and well-rounded religious belief and practice, which is what is able to protect them from Remic and the other vampires in Sinners, because she's able to realize that Smoke isn't the same Smoke that you knew. Once he was bitten, that wasn't Stack's brother anymore. His soul was trapped in his body. He just wasn't him anymore. And it's Annie's knowledge of Hudoo that allowed her to be kind of the protection for all of the cast members. And again, it was the necklace that she actually gave to Smoke which kept him and Stack safe when they were fighting in the war, when they were in Chicago doing all their gangster side quests. It was her kind of religious belief that held them throughout the movie, and I think that's a really nice touch. It's also because of Annie's religious beliefs and religious practices that they were able to know how to actually face the vampires, because everybody else that was in the juke joint that night wasn't aware of what they were supposed to do when Smoke came back to life. I think it was really interesting how Ryan Coogler used something like Hudoo, which in modern times is often seen as demonic and evil, to kind of portray that it has aspects that are positive and it is something that people really believe in, and that some people believe that it can help. have to talk about Mary, who is played by Haley Steinfeld. There's been so much discourse on the internet, especially on Twitter, about who should have played Mary, and they keep showing pictures of black, like monoracially black women, and that doesn't make any sense to me. The whole point of Haley Steinfeld's character is that she's supposed to be white passing. She's not supposed to be a light-skinned black woman. She is supposed to be able to pass for white, because that is the crux of her storyline. If she was black, just light-skinned black, it just wouldn't make any sense, because the whole point is, why is she allowed to be in the juke joint but Remic and the others aren't? And the character's ethnicity is actually really similar to the actress's ethnicity in real life. So I actually think it was a perfect casting by Ryan Coogler to have Haley play Mary. But let's get into Mary a little bit more. So Mary is the love interest of the other brother, Stack, and they have a taboo relationship because, again, Mary is white passing. And in 1930s Mississippi, under Jim Crow, white people and black people were not allowed to be in a relationship. They weren't allowed to be in a sexual relationship. They weren't allowed to be in an official relationship. They weren't allowed to be married. They weren't allowed to be boyfriend and girlfriend. They weren't allowed to even be in the same places, to be honest, because that's how much segregation had an impact on day-to-day life, which is why we see Stack being very apprehensive when Mary is coming up to talk to him in public and she's talking about the sexual stuff that they did in public, because that can really get him killed. There's been so many real-life examples of black men being killed because they have been associated to a white man under Jim Crow. We only have to look at Emmett Till to see an example of that, who was a young boy who was only 14 years old, who was lynched because a white woman claimed that he whistled or winked at her. So it was real life dangerous for Mary and Stack to be together. And this is why we see him tell her, you know, I want you to marry a nice white man, I want you to live your life, I want you to be safe because I love you, because he knows his love for her is not seen as valid. It's dangerous for him under the law. You see how Mary's struggle as well comes a lot from her identity. She is very obviously white passing, however her granddad's dad or her granddad is like half black, or one of her grandparents, like 2 generations back, is black, which is why she feels an affinity for black people. It's also mentioned that her mother like helped to raise Stack and Smoke, again, which is a reason for their closeness. But again, in this time in America in the 1930s under Jim Crow, even having a drop of black blood meant that you were black, and this is because race is a social construct. Obviously we can see that people look different. I'm obviously black, we can see that, and there are people that are white and there are people that are Asian. That's how we look phenotypically. But the construct of race was created, and America in this time period is a perfect example of that. You could look like Mary, but if you had one black grandparent, you were seen as black and you would be treated as such, which is why a lot of white people at the time would pass. There's a really famous book called Passing that I feel like a lot of people should read, and there's a film that's based on it as well, about how a lot of people in this period would pass as white in order to get better jobs, to marry the people that they love, and just lift themselves out of poverty. And it's understandable, and it's understandable why Mary would do this too. But we can see in the film that her love for Stack kind of surpasses her wanting of being white, but it's also her whiteness that puts everybody in danger. In the juke joint, and Remic and the other 2 vampires approach, it is Mary that thinks that she can be the intercessor between the two, being a white woman. And I don't know if that's a bit of the white savior complex or what specifically Ryan was trying to do with that, but to me, I interpreted it as, although she was part black and she loved black people, she'd grown up around them, at the end of the day she knew that she had privilege and she knew that she could use it, and her white savior complex in a way put everybody else in danger, because it was her going outside and speaking to Remic that led him to turn her and led to all the events that happened at the juke joint that night. So in a way, if she had just stepped back, minded her business, then there would be no storyline. It would be for the greater good, but there would be no storyline. And I know a lot of people are going to say, obviously she did it because the juke joint wasn't making any money and Remic had money, so I understand that, but again, it was her privilege that allowed her to be the intercessor between the 2 groups. Now, I don't know about you guys, but my favourite scene in the whole entire film is the scene where Sammy is playing his guitar and we see the past, present and future of black music merge all together. It almost felt spiritual when I was watching it, like the hairs on my arms literally stood up. The creativity and just the way that we saw the power of music and the way that it could harken back to our ancestors but also to our forebearers in the future, to me was just amazing and was a cinematic masterpiece. I also thought the way that they weaved in the mythology of having somebody that can play music so true, it kind of breaks the veil between the living and the dead. This is again mythology that I'm familiar with as a historian and you can find in so many cultures around the world, because music again is a way of humans expressing themselves and is a way that people praise and worship. We even see it in Christianity with gospel music. It's a way of us feeling in touch with something otherworldly and something bigger than us, and I think Sinners really conveys this in an amazing way. I have to talk about one of the most creative and I think most layered villains that I've seen in horror in a long time. I feel like horror is one of my favorite film genres, and I feel like it was becoming quite repetitive and just boring, like cheap jump scares and no depth, but this film changed all of that. Remic, who is the main antagonist in the film, played by Jack O'Connell, and if you used to watch Skins in the UK, you know who he is, I think was an amazing and masterfully done villain. This is a villain who, although he's evil, he has a backstory, and his backstory is so important to his character and why he does the things he does. And we're going to get into that right now. So, even the way that we're first introduced to Remic, to me, is such a cinematic masterpiece. We see him symbolically falling from the sky, and to me that kind of mirrored Satan's falling from the heavens and his fall from grace when he turns against God in the Bible. So I think that was a really interesting and symbolic comparison for Ryan Coogler to draw visually when he first introduces us to the character. And when he is falling from the heavens, he lands in a very rural area, and it's because he's running from these vampire hunters, and these vampire hunters are named as the Choctaws. For those of you who aren't familiar, obviously America is land that was quite literally stolen and colonized by Europeans, and the native people that were there before them are the Native Americans. The Native Americans are made up of lots of different tribes who are all very distinct and have their own beliefs and practices. However, the Choctaws were very important to the storyline because it is said that there's no Choctaws in this area anymore, and that is because of something known as a Trail of Tears. And let me tell you what the Trail of Tears is while I bake my makeup. So the Trail of Tears was the forcible removal of Native Americans, and one of the groups being the Choctaws, from the land in the Mississippi. And this was around 60,000 Native Americans that were removed from their land. And this is land that they were indigenous to, land that their family had been on for thousands of years, and they were essentially told to up and leave. The 5 tribes that made up the people in the Trail of Tears were the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Maybe if I butchered any of those names, by the way. Forcible removal took place between the 1830s and the 1850s, and the natives were being pushed out of their ancestral lands to lands past the Mississippi Delta. The reason that this is called the Trail of Tears is because the Native Americans were forced to quite literally walk, like actually walk, from their homes to lands thousands of miles away that were going to become known as the native reserves. Imagine one day being told to get out of your house, doesn't matter if you're barefoot or not, take what you can carry and walk, say, from London to Spain, or like London to Manchester, and you're going to be forced to live on this little patch of land in Manchester with everybody that looks like you, and it doesn't matter what you had going on back home because the land you had back home is mine. That's essentially what the Trail of Tears was. And this caused immense pain and suffering. Thousands died on the walk because, again, they're walking, sometimes probably barefoot, in any conditions, with young children as well. So you can only imagine the amount of suffering this forced displacement caused. Despite this, some Native Americans that were on the Trail of Tears heard about the famine that was going on in Ireland and actually collected money for charity to send to the Irish. It shows the solidarity between groups that were being colonized and controlled at the time. And it's also again really interesting because it is the Native Americans who are the vampire hunters, and Remic is Irish. Let's go back to Remic because he's so interesting. So Remic's character is a vampire, and he wants to turn all the black people and the few Asians in the juke joint into vampires so that he can join them and he can assimilate them. To me, Remic is just a metaphor for cultural appropriation, which is so prevalent today and always has been. Black culture has always been stolen, it has been copied, it has been usurped, and it has been treasured whilst our people haven't been. And I think that Remic is a really good example of this because again, he wants to go into the juke joint, turn everybody and assimilate them and adopt their culture to assimilate it and make it his own. But the reason that he's doing this is because of his own struggles at the hands of colonialism. Many of you will know that black people and Irish people have some sense of solidarity because of the way they've been treated at the hands of the British. We will remember signs like the no blacks, the no dogs and the no Irish, but it actually goes back a lot further than that. Before Ireland was fully absorbed into the United Kingdom and was controlled by Britain, they were independent, and they had independent beliefs, they had pagan beliefs, and a lot of Christian missionaries went into Ireland in the 5th and 6th centuries and converted the Irish. Sometimes it was violent and sometimes it wasn't, but then again there were waves and waves of colonization that happened in Ireland from that point on, the 18 and 1900s, and this caused a lot of friction between the Irish and the British, which is still even lasting today. And Remic says that he himself was a victim of this colonialism. He had Christianity forced upon him, he had his lands taken away from him, he had his culture stolen, which is why he feels some sense of solidarity towards the black Americans in the juke joint. In his vampirism, he has become exactly what he hated, and I think that's the irony of it. I love Remic as a villain. I think again he's a really layered villain, and I would love to see like a prequel just about his backstory and even about the Native American backstory, even if it's just to see him do that little Irish dance again, because I loved it. There's also a very powerful scene towards the end of the film where Remic has Preacher Boy Sammy basically by the neck and he's dunking him in and out of the water, kind of mimicking a baptism. To me, that's how I saw it. And when Sammy begins to recite the Lord's Prayer, Remic also recites the Lord's Prayer, and so do all of the vampires. To me, what this symbolizes is that Remic is essentially saying, you know, the Lord's, well, he doesn't essentially say it, he says it word for word. The Lord's Prayer is not going to save you. I know this prayer too. It was forced onto me by those that took my culture and took my family away, but it still gives me a sense of comfort. And I think this is something that's going to be very palpable and something very understandable to people that were colonized or people that have been controlled or removed from where they're from. Because to me, in this scene, it was kind of showing that Remic had once been in that same position that Sammy had been in, and to some people they also interpreted it as, you know, even the devil knows the Bible, even the devil knows scripture, if that's what you believe in. So I think this is a scene that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways and has a lot of layers to it, but actually shows a more human side to Remic as well. But you know, as in most films, good always champions over evil, and Remic ends up dying when the sunlight comes, and Sammy ends up being one of the sole survivors of the juke joint. I also wanted to touch on the two Asian characters in the film because I feel like a lot of people don't know about the quite prominent presence that Asian Americans had in the South at this time. I don't know why I'm like waving this around like a stick, I'm sorry. But yeah, there was quite a strong Asian presence in the South during this period. They were obviously minorities, but they were treated with more esteem than black people were, usually because they were business owners and they were able to leverage their economic power in order to kind of carve out a better place for themselves. We even see at the beginning of the film how they've split the family business, and there's one shop that serves white customers and one shop that serves black customers. And again, Asians being POCs can understand kind of racial prejudice, but they're never going to understand it to the extent that the black Americans have, because they never experienced Jim Crow. They didn't experience 400 years of slavery. But Asian Americans had also suffered a lot at the hands of the American government. What I do think is interesting, and what a lot of Asian Americans actually spoke about on TikTok, is the way that the shop owner weaponizes her pain. we see that she's happy to work with Smoke and Stack and all the other black people when she's making money. They needed her to make the sign for the juke joint, bring all the stuff so that the food could be cooked, and she had gotten along with them. She knew Smoke and Stack through her husband for years. However, and they were in solidarity together in the juke joint against the vampires. Yet when it came time to really stand together and stick it out until the daytime, she was the one that ultimately let the vampires in. A lot of people were saying that this is very, very reminiscent of the relationship between Asian Americans and Black Americans at the time, where they were happy to interact and get along with Black Americans, but when it really came time to when it really came down to it, they kind of othered themselves and also became a mechanism of white supremacy. And there are a lot of stories where there's been shop owners who have pulled guns out on black children, and there's just a history of pain between those two communities as well. And I think it was important that Ryan Coogler touched on that. The use of the Native Americans, the Asian Americans, the Black Americans, the white Americans in this film, and the research that's been put behind it, to me was just amazing, and also shows what a masterful and intelligent filmmaker Ryan Coogler is. One of the performances I was most impressed by throughout this film was given by Miles Catton, who played Preacher Boy Sammy. This was his first ever acting role, and he was one of the main characters. And not only can he act, but he can sing so well. But his character is actually inspired by a real life blues artist called Robert Johnson. And Robert Johnson has a wild story and like a wild lore around him. So again, in 1930s in Mississippi, Robert is growing up and he's working on a plantation, and he is told one day to go to a crossroads. And Robert has a dream all his life of becoming a famous blues player, but it was said that he wasn't really talented and he couldn't really play the guitar well. So one day when he goes to this crossroads, he supposedly sees the devil. And as we all know, you never make a deal with the devil, but clearly Robert wanted to be a blues singer more than everything, because he does make this deal with the devil, and the devil gives him the talent that he needs to become the next big blues singer. We can see how heavily inspired this story is to the character of Preacher Boy Sammy. Again, he's working in the field, he wants to play his instruments, and his dad gives him a very foreshadowing message saying, if you dance with the devil, you may bring him home with you. And that's exactly what happened, and I think that's a nod to the story of Robert Johnson, which I really like. Also interesting to me how powerful music was, especially in Sammy's life, that he chose to disobey his dad, who's a preacher's, wishes in order to have one night of freedom. But last but certainly not least, I want to talk about the character Delta Slim. I feel like he was the comedic relief in the film. I feel like the little jokes that he made and just his character overall of him being like an alcoholic was really good for the storyline. But there's also a lot of pain behind this character, which we see in the scene when he's in the car with Stack and Preacher Boy Sammy. He goes on to talk about how he's obviously a musician, and he had created a band with a few of his friends, previously been used for convict leasing. However, his friend was sadly lynched, and when he's telling the story, it's so painful that he actually goes into a hum and then it goes into a song, which I felt like was so palpable, because as we know, blues music is a way that black people were able to convey their pain, and it was also an art form and a way for them to express freedom. So I think that scene really encapsulated that. Delta Slim's account of the lynching is something that people in the South are very familiar with and were very used to at that point. Racial terror, white terror, intimidation by the KKK was something that black people were constantly on alert for because it was so prevalent. Out of the 5,000 lynchings that took place in America in this period, 525 of them took place in Mississippi in the 1930s, which is the time obviously in which Sinners is set. So it's a very palpable fear for black Americans living at that time. What's really sad as well is that lynching and racial terror was used as a form of intimidation in order to stop black people from setting up businesses, in order from stopping them to vote, in order just to create terror, and for them to know that white supremacy was something that was constantly looming over them. And for me, something that really hits home, and I can insert pictures here but they're quite graphic, is that lynchings became kind of a public outing almost. People would take their small children to watch black men and women being tortured and then hung and abused, and that kind of dehumanization is just so hard to imagine, because today we're so far removed from it, but this was a common occurrence. This was a common occurrence for black people living in this time, especially in the deep south, in places like Mississippi. White racists at this time were so evil that they would even use the images of the lynchings on postcards and send it in letters to friends and family to circulate images of black pain like that. To me, it's just so sinister, and I don't know how it became normalized, but it was a normal occurrence that took place. The history of lynching is so dark and it's so sad that even for me to talk about it now, I don't even feel like I'm doing it enough justice, and it could have a whole video on its own, but it only further shows the plight that black Americans had to experience at this time. And Delta Slim is a perfect example for this, because the trauma of his friend's lynching is so heavy on him, and we see this throughout the film. One thing also that really makes me sad and that I thought about is that regardless of if they hadn't been turned into vampires, everybody in that juke joint still would have died, because as we know, the KKK had set them up and they were going to come in the morning and slaughter everybody. And that's something that really sat with me, is that although the juke joint was used as something for those people to feel freedom and to feel like an escape from racial terror, from injustice, from poverty, from hard work, they couldn't even enjoy that one little piece of freedom, because in the morning the KKK were going to come and kill them all, which is really sad. So in a way, Remic's vampirism kind of freed them from that fate, even though it wasn't the best way to go about it. But my makeup is finished now, and so is this breakdown. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I am going to do my hair, but not on this video. And yeah, I had a lot of fun researching all of this stuff. A lot of it was stuff that I was already familiar with, but this video allowed me to prepare and further research these topics and really understand the pain that black people experienced in the deep south. And not just that, but the way that despite their pain, they were still able to have such an impact on music and culture. And I love the way that this has been put into a positive light today through the film Sinners. So if there's anything else that you want me to speak about or that I may have missed, please leave a comment so we can have a conversation. And if you want any more history videos, let me know what you want me to talk about in the comments below. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.